This podcast is made possible by your support and your donations. Thank you. And by the purchase of my book called Everyday Buddhism, Real-Life Buddhist Teachings and Practices for Real Change. I will post an affiliate link to the book on Amazon in the show notes. And if you've already read it, please take a minute to rate and review. And also consider purchasing it again for a friend or family member as a gift. Welcome to Everyday Buddhism, making every day better by applying the proven tools found in Buddhist concepts. Welcome to episode 113 of Everyday Buddhism, Making Every Day Better. First, my apologies to Nate Klemp, the guest on this episode, for the delay in releasing it. We recorded the episode on November 19th, and I was about to edit and release it when on December 13th, Friday the 13th, by the way, I slipped on ice in my driveway, fell and broke the humerus in my right or dominant arm in two places. And I spent a few nights in the hospital following the fall due to recurring episodes of syncope from what I understand came from shock and dehydration. But I'm home now. I'm staying conscious and my arm is healing. So, back to podcasting. In this episode, I talk with Nate Klemp, PhD. Dr. Nate Klemp is a best-selling author and formally trained philosopher. He is the author of the book Open, Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World. Nate is also the co-author of the New York Times Editor's Choice book, The 80-80 Marriage, A New Model for a Happier, Stronger Marriage, and the New York Times Bestseller, Start Here, Master the Lifelong Habit of Wellbeing. He has been featured in the LA Times, the New York Times, the Times London, and has appeared on Good Morning America and Talks at Google. Nate co-founded the mindfulness training company Life Cross Training and holds a BA and MA in philosophy from Stanford University and a PhD from Princeton University. I cannot think of a better guest to have on the podcast during these uncertain and nearly apocalyptic times. His new book, Open, Living with an Expansive Mind in a Distracted World, is an important antidote to the ongoing trauma and division of the times. He offers the remedy of opening our minds and hearts despite our instinct to close them. So stay tuned as we talk about how we're living in a time of closure, closing in through our screens and closing to each other, how a quote from him, how we can annihilate the power of the smartphone, unquote, about the practice of skillful closing when things get too intense, how our mindset is contagious and how it reinforces our environment of closure, how we talk to each other about politics in either strategic mode, where we're trying to win, or communication mode, where we're trying to understand. We talk about non-drug psychedelic experience and psychedelic-assisted therapy. And of course, mindfulness, meditation, and the practice of open awareness meditation like Dzogchen. And so much more. So, also, instead of skipping the end announcements this time, like I'm sure you've gotten the habit of doing, please keep listening after my conversation with Nate. Our Everyday Buddhism membership community and Sangha has moved to Patreon in an effort to engage more podcast listeners in the Patreon community and also in the Everyday Sangha and my Everyday Buddhism Substack. Stick around after the conversation with Nate to hear all the details. But now, on to the conversation with Nate Klemp. So, hello, Nate Klemp. Dr. Nate Klemp, by the way. I don't know if I should I refer to you as Dr. Nate Klemp?
Hey, whatever you want. It's all good.
No, I think I'll just say Nate. You feel Nate to me. So, um, thank you so much for joining me on this podcast. I've been so looking forward to having you on this podcast. I loved your book. Um, I know I bet you say that to all your guests. Well, most times I say something similar, but sometimes I really say I loved your book. In your case, it was I loved your book because I don't know, it was like it's a collection of like wisdom, like wise tips. Um, that wisdom seems to defy your age. Sorry for any ageism that might be delivered there, but with a conversation, like it was delivered with a conversation with a friend, and a friend with a great sense of humor. So I was like, I just flipped through that book. You just took me away, and so I'm glad that you were able to make it to this podcast. But I wanted to tell our listeners is that this was to be recorded a few weeks ago, and I had to reschedule, so we were scheduled for today. But I'm it sort of seems propitious that you're on today, because I think we're all maybe in the midst, or there's a lot of us, at least my listeners, I think, are in the midst of probably more angst and division, that even more angst and division than what we have been through. So you're like a balm at the right time. So thank you.
Well, Wendy, it's so good to be here. I'm just really excited for this conversation. And you're right. The timing is perfect. It's a very intense moment in
I
our history.
Yeah, and I wondered. We can get to that later, I guess. We can get to that later. But let's do this now. Just quick. How do you feel right now? I mean, about where things are, since your book is all about sort of overcoming divisiveness and that kind of thing.
Yeah, the main message of the book is that we're living in a time of closure,
Hmm.
both in the sense that we're closing down by experiencing this addiction to our screens and distraction, but also on a more external level where we seem to be closing down to anyone who disagrees with us,
Yeah.
particularly about politics.
Yeah.
So we're recording this, what is it now, two
Two
weeks
weeks.
after the election
It although seems
in the
like about a
United
month.
States.
Yeah, yeah.
And I live in Boulder, Colorado, a left of center town, and that tends to be my political orientation. So this is a very intense moment for me. I think it's a very intense moment for a lot of people. But interestingly, I wrote the book. It came out almost a year ago in February. I feel like it's actually more relevant now than it was when it came out
Yeah.
because what I see happening, which is not surprising, is this retreat into closure on both sides.
Yeah.
And on my side, what that looks like is this retreat into a kind of fear and paranoia and worst case scenario thinking. And do I need to move to another country? And, all these things. And what I've been trying to do, my practice has really been a practice of listening and see to what degree can I open to the other side. And that includes both people I know, friends, family members who might have voted for the opposite candidate, but also just I mean, this is going to sound crazy, but I've been like listening to Trump and JD Vance on the Joe Rogan podcast
Right.
and not trying to like to become a MAGA Trumper, but trying to just like really understand what is it about this set of ideas that's so compelling in this particular moment? Because there's got to be something, right? And I I find that to just be a more helpful stance than the stance of this is lunacy. Anyone who believes in this is crazy. I just don't think that's going to get us very far.
Yeah, I think you touched on a lot of what I've been dealing with as well. I did the same thing. I jumped right on that podcast with Trump. I did. It's because I wanted to find a way to like him, you know. I wanted to find a way. I didn't really want to really like him, but I wanted to find a way that, like in your book talks about this, to feel like him as a person, because I heard that he comes across more like that on the Rogan podcast than you ever see him in any other way. But I really did enjoy it. And, there's a lot of things we can talk about that. Like if I was raised like Trump with nobody loving me, I would probably be Trump, so there's a lot of like that we could talk about. But I also did this closing down, and it was at the same time as I was reading your book again, reviewing it again for our podcast. I saw that I was closing down, not necessarily to the other side, which is more what I reacted like in 2016, but more of a, uh, uh, sort of a, okay, I'm hiding from everything right now. It's the only way I can deal with anything. I'm just gonna hide. I'm just gonna not look at anything and any screen. I'm just gonna meditate way more. I'm gonna play my music way more. I'm gonna do, just anything but that. Okay. So I was doing that, which I know is a way of healing a little bit and go, getting myself prepared to move on. But I did realize that I was closing up. So it's so true.
Yeah. Well, and I actually think that there's a lot of wisdom to that. And in the book, I call this the practice of skillful closing.
Uh-huh.
That on the one hand, the argument I want to make here is that in this era of closure, one of the most powerful experiences we can have is cultivating more openness,
Right.
both to our own mind and to other people who disagree with us. And yet, I think there are moments where it's just too intense.
Yeah.
Pema
That's
Chodron, she calls this like the danger zone. And she has this great way of describing it. You're swimming in the deep end of the pool and you don't know how to swim. And
exactly.
in those moments, you don't stay in the middle of the pool. You go to the side
And
and
hang on.
you hang on and it's okay to close, whatever that looks like for you. I mean, you were talking about like meditating more and sort of shutting off. And for me, it's like, watching football and my favorite, the Denver Broncos or whatever it is, right? We all have our own way. But then I think once you've settled a little bit, and this is what I hear you saying as well, there's this opportunity, I think, to
Yep.
see to what degree can I open to the discomfort I feel about this, to the sadness I feel, to the fear that I feel, and then even to the ideas themselves and the people themselves who are a part of a movement that might scare me on some level. It's
Yeah.
not easy work,
No, it,
but I
it
think,
isn't.
if we start from the premise that our mindset is contagious, then if we're staying in that closed down, polarized state, we're participating
Right.
in a world where everyone's also in that state and we're reinforcing these conditions of closure. So I think if we all agree that our mindset is somewhat contagious, then if we can go out into the world, and even if it's just in the midst of our own community, and be a little bit more open, we really are tangibly changing the world simply by changing our own mind. And I think that's a core part of the Buddhist idea,
Sure.
but I think it's possible, and now is the time to be doing it.
Yeah, I wasn't prepared in 2016, and I never did really recover too much. And then we went into the pandemic, and I didn't recover from that too well. But all of that seemed like maybe practice ground, like really basic training, like doing the worst possible things to prepare for this thing. And I feel like I will emerge from this little place I'm in to a better place. But we jumped into the deep end here, which is not really what I intended, but I
Yeah, let's start in the shallow end.
had, yeah,
I like
yeah.
it.
Let's like ramp up a little bit. But I had to ask about the time because it's just so much on the mind, I think, of everybody. And of course, I share your liberal views and live in New York State, so um, we have the same similar experience, I believe. But one of the things I wanted to ask first, which is the typical, I share your bio at the beginning and all that, but I'd like your sort of, if you could introduce yourself in a way that shares a bit of your personal journey into philosophy, because that's sort of who you are. You're it's when you say the word philosopher, nobody thinks of somebody like you. They think Socrates and the Stoics, and you're just not the same sort of stereotype, if you will. But I love that. By the way, I it was one of my half of my major in undergraduate in college, so philosophy was always my thing, but also into mindfulness and meditation and writing. So just if you could, and I know this is like you got to give us a 2-bit journey here or a 10-cent
Mm.
journey because we want to get on to other things, but I'd like to have you introduce yourself.
Well, let's see. I would say this whole journey started when I was in my early 20s in college, and I had a pragmatic career fork in the road that I reached where I was like, do I want to become a jazz piano player or a philosopher? And I thought I would go with philosopher because it was going to be a better career choice, more pragmatic.
Yeah.
So I decided I want to become a professional philosopher because I was fascinated by these great thinkers throughout history and the kinds of questions that you ask. And so got my undergrad in philosophy, got a master's degree in philosophy, ended up going to Princeton to get my PhD in philosophy. And there was a moment toward the end of that journey that really changed everything for me. And that was I was just out biking with my wife, and I had a pretty serious bike crash where our handlebars tangled together and I fell on my head and ended up having a pretty serious concussion with all the aftermath of post-concussive syndrome. And for the first time ever in my life, I had this experience that I didn't know how to manage my own mind. And I was experiencing some really intense anxiety and depression for the first time, really intense problems in my marriage for the first time. And what was most interesting about it is I had this realization that all of these cognitive, philosophical, theoretical tools that I had been cultivating at a pretty high level, none of those tools were going to help me face this crisis that I found myself in.
Yeah.
And so that was like a really one of those moments where life just punched me in the face and it changed the whole direction of my career after that. Because what I started to realize is that there were these amazing practices like yoga and mindfulness and meditation, which were not theoretical.
Right.
They were embodied, they were practical, they were the kind of thing where I would do the practice and I felt as though I was becoming just a little bit better at navigating my own mind and the chaos that was happening in my life. And so I ended up being a professor for a little bit at Pepperdine University in Los Angeles, but really I just got fascinated by this whole world of of various practices that yoga scene in LA. I got really interested in Dzogchen meditation, all sorts of these different things. This is now that was maybe 17 years ago, almost 20 years ago.
Mhm.
And so since then, that's been my primary work is exploring these practices, but also writing about them. So I wrote the book Open, but I also write about relationships with my wife. We wrote a book called The 80/80 Marriage. And that's kind of what I'm up to these days is just continuing to investigate and explore these practices, but then also write about how we can apply these to some of the unique problems we face in modern life.
Yeah, and that's so interesting because some of the complaints about philosophy is that even though there is a discipline in philosophy, applied philosophy, it's mostly seemingly out of touch with life, you know what I mean? We all ask the big questions, and some of us ask them more than others. But again, if we ask the big questions, if there's no like how to after that, it's like, okay, I asked that question and got a lot of interesting answers, but it's not helping me one bit. Now, those people who follow Stoicism would probably disagree with me, but uh, if you go too far into philosophy, it's the same thing. But a lot of people go into Buddhism for the same reason. I mean, I was big into philosophy, and that's what attracted me to Buddhism. It was the mental
Mm.
bling, I always call it. I was like so into the philosophy of Buddhism and the great thinkers that go way, 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 way back, and the people that came out of Nalanda University, and it's Nagarjuna and all the ideas he put forth. I mean, those are deep philosophical explorations, but Buddhism developed a how-to, you know, and that's and it took me a long time to like, okay, I'm not going to stay here in this mental bling. I'm going to learn how to do something with it. Uh, so yeah, I agree with you, and I loved your little intro to that. And what a way to make a living, huh? It's pretty cool. Like just play with these ideas and concepts, apply them, and write about them, right?
Well, yeah, and to your point, I would say that in Buddhism, you see that distinction between the pure scholar and the practitioner.
Right.
I think that's also true in the Western philosophical tradition. It's easy to forget nowadays where being a philosophy professor means writing highly technical papers that get published with the goal of
Yeah.
getting tenure, that there's a whole tradition of what I would call living philosophy. You know,
Yeah.
in the Greek philosophy, you
Greek,
mentioned the
right.
Stoics, the 19th century transcendentalists, people like Emerson and Thoreau.
Yeah.
You know, Thoreau is the ultimate, in my opinion, in terms of somebody who's embodying and living philosophically. You know, he's moving to this cabin for 2 years and 2 months, and so I think you find the same thing that there are strands of all of these traditions that really do emphasize the lived experiential aspect of the practice.
Yeah.
And then I love that your term mental bling.
Yeah.
There's strands in all of these traditions where you can just bling out on like the
Yeah. Oh,
theory and and just get totally in your head. And that's super cool and interesting. I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But to
there's
me, it's
nothing.
not as
Yeah.
helpful.
Yeah, there's nothing wrong with it. I mean, I can geek out, on Nagarjuna with the best of them, but at the same time, it's like, but yeah, Nagarjuna is the one that said, without emptiness, nothing is possible. So that's pretty pragmatic in a lot of ways to use that
Hmm.
as a mantra or a tool. But first, you have to understand emptiness, I guess. But that's okay. So anyway, first thing I want to say about your book is I said that you were like talking to a good friend, a good wise friend whose wisdom is beyond his years, but he's also got a sense of humor. And start out by saying you had me immediately at screen binging. I mean, you hooked me, and I'm sure that was your. I don't know if your editor said like put that up front or whatever, but it really it really works. But I'll just give a little something so the listeners know where the heck I'm going here, and then I'll invite you to sort of join in. But Nate did this experiment of screen binging as a technique to overcome distraction and division caused by, legacy and new media, but also to overcome his screen cravings. And the interesting thing, the technique that he used, although it seems absolutely ridiculous when you read about it at first when he starts talking about it, it's really based on a tantric or a Buddhist tantra technique about, turning into your harmful desires and transforming them. Like in tantra, which I studied, my background is primarily you know, Himalayan or Tibetan Buddhism. And the Buddhist tantric teachings say that, anger is transformed into wisdom. And so, you learned how to transform your um, screen scream cravings into something the more useful. But you also pointed out all the statistics of screen craving, which everybody will agree with. Like you said, the average American adult spends 11 hours on electronic devices daily, which is like creepy as heck. And then the average user picks up their smartphone 2,600 plus times a day. Actually, I was tempted to see if I how many times to sort of time myself to see how often I did it. But can you share your story of this screen binging technique? First of all, um, why you decided you needed to do this, how you decided on this technique, this particular method, and then how it worked. I know the answer a little bit, but I'll let you
Right.
tell the story.
Well, as you mentioned, it sounds crazy, but the basic idea that I was starting from is that, like many people these days, I feel like I'm experiencing a mild to moderate form of screen addiction, which just means that all those idle throwaway moments throughout the day, I'm sitting at the doctor's office, I'm waiting to pick my daughter up from school. I have this almost insatiable urge to pick up my device and do something, anything, text messages, email, right? And most of the discussion around how you break through a screen addiction like this focuses on restraint. And I actually think
Yes.
that's great. And I think we should focus on those tools. And I talk about a lot of those tools in the book. But, things like limiting your screen time and, you locking up your device in a safe so you can't access it for a couple hours, they're all great tactics. But I think if all we do is focus on restraint, there's a weird way in which we're actually like building the energy of desire.
Oh, yeah.
It's you think about like the prohibition and alcohol, right?
Right.
We're trying to keep people from drinking, but it had the opposite effect to a certain degree. It created even more craving and desire for
Yeah.
the substance. So the wisdom of this tantric approach, and Chogyam Trungpa called it feast practice, is that if you, with intention, go into the thing that's creating your cravings and allow yourself to indulge and perhaps even overindulge, there's a way in which you can uproot the very foundation of that desire. So that's what I did. As you mentioned, it was for 3 days, all day, every day, because, I'm one of those people who I probably check my phone a couple hours a day, but I wanted to see like what happens when I do it for 14 hours a day.
Oh, God.
And it was really this crazy experience where a couple things happened. One, I realized that all this talk about our screens and sleep, it's totally real. So when I was doing this, I would wake up every morning at like 2:40 a.m., just completely lit up with adrenaline, like no chance of going back to sleep. So that was interesting. I think the more interesting thing though is I realized that the thing driving this addiction is this craving for novelty, for something new. You open up your
Mhm.
phone and you go into your text messages, and it's like there's some new message, or there's a new email, or there's a fresh feed on Instagram. And by overindulging in this way, by screen binging, I had the experience where it felt like I had seen everything there was to see. And I realized that in a strange way, I had annihilated the superpower of my smartphone because I there was nothing novel anymore. And so I actually think this is a really interesting practice. And I know your listeners might recoil when I say this. You don't have to do it for 3 days, but like if you just took a day and said, instead of trying not to use my phone and my TV and my computer today, I'm going to allow myself to just go all in and just like gorge on a buffet of mind treats all day. It's really interesting because you are disrupting your habit system and you are gaining some wisdom into what it is that's driving you. So I actually encourage everybody to do it, to try it
I,
out. Maybe it's just a day, maybe it's a half day, but it's a powerful experience, I think.
yeah. I was tempted. I haven't done it. I was tempted. I haven't because I'm right now in the process of trying to disconnect. So it was like I
Yes.
don't know whether I should, I have to be on a lot because I have to post my marketing stuff. I don't have a marketing. I'm it. I do my own marketing and promotion. So when I'm trying to promote some podcast or Dharma talk or whatever or something, I I do it on all the media sites. So I'm always on there and I always like complain to my wife, well, you're lucky. You don't have to be on there. There's no reason for you to be on there. So you're lucky. You can just totally disconnect. It's like, but so I've been tempted to do it, but it seemed to work for you. And so I think it would work for anybody. It reminds me of I love what you said. What did you say? You disconnected the from the superpower of the smart
Yeah,
device
I
or
annihilated my smartphone's
smartphone.
superpower, which is novelty.
I honestly that line is just perfect. So thank you. I hope other people will go and annihilate that power. It reminds me of a practice Sam Harris once said about if you watch the stuff you say in your head, like that jerk or why did this person do this? Those stories we tell ourselves that disconnect us from others, even our closest person. Um, and we hear those stories. He said if you go into a room by yourself and if you say it out loud and just keep saying it and saying it and saying it, you will completely abhor that thought and you will have a lot of trouble ever thinking that story again. And I've tried that one and it works.
Mm.
So I think there is a lot of um, pragmatic wisdom in that, like going into it, just going all in, like you said. I think that's great. Um,
Yeah, and I think it is worth combining that with the more restraint-based approaches. So things like kicking your phones out of your bedroom, having some place in your house where you put your phone so it's not around with you all the time. I have another practice that I love that I call dopamine dessert, which is the idea of scheduling time in your day for distraction. And this is actually I think we fail to see the parallels between the way we consume food and our digital consumption.
yeah,
But like in the realm of food, it would be insane to just eat chocolate cake and ice cream all day every day, right? We all know
right.
like that's why would you do that? That's crazy. You're gonna really hurt yourself. But in the realm of digital consumption, we somehow think that's okay.
Yeah,
And so the idea of dopamine dessert is to schedule time for your dopamine dessert. And what that frees up for me is that when I then have a craving earlier in the day, like, oh, I want to check the news, I can just think to myself, I've got dopamine dessert coming up. And if I spoil my dopamine dessert by checking now, it's not going to taste as good. Like
no,
it
yeah.
actually feels even better to indulge in distraction when you've given yourself a little period away from it versus if you're doing it constantly, the dopamine hit, it just kind of wears off. It's not that good.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I do have a scheduled time where I allow myself to, like, you know, do a little doom scrolling, look at
Yeah,
Instagram, just do it, just and then and it is like dessert. I'm satiated. I feel that sense of
exactly.
I feel satiated. Okay, I got my junk now. I can go on. Next in your book that you lead us through gentle opening exercises after this screen binging opening, which is again a brilliant way to edit a book. And and then you share these gentle shift exercises, which are pretty cool. But I'm going to just hit on this a little bit. And then you talk about using psychedelics for opening. And you go into other things. So if this bothers you guys, just hang on. We go past this. You provided a lot of cautions and emphasized that, you can get the same realizations without psychedelics, and there are many people who would really want to stay away from this practice, and that you shouldn't do it without, trained counselors. Personally, I don't feel it is a right approach for me, but maybe I'm too stuck to my views. But I also, it's because I'm a baby boomer. I'm a hippie, man. I experimented with LSD and every kind of drug in the universe, back in my 20s and 30s. And I still use marijuana for pain because I have a chronic illness and it causes pain. But I like to experience my meditation and open awareness clean, and I wouldn't do it. But I want you to share just a little more about that because, it is pretty much in the news, not the news, in the culture. A lot of people are doing it. They're doing the ayahuasca retreats and they're doing this and they're doing that. And I think some people who are stuck on the maybe I'm missing something, maybe
Mm.
would like to hear from just a little bit what you think about this.
Yeah, I like how you mentioned that we want to tread really carefully here, and that in my view, psychedelic assisted therapy, and I think that's the first thing we have to distinguish
Okay,
psychedelics from psychedelic assisted therapy.
good point.
Because when people talk about psychedelics, it's like there's no distinction between going off with your buddies into the woods and taking ayahuasca or LSD in a completely unsupervised, you know, open container. There's no distinction between that and having a very skilled guide where you're combining the compound with very intensive psychotherapy. And I think the distinction there is huge.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
I don't think it's necessarily wrong to do psychedelics recreationally, but I just think it's important that we distinguish those two.
good.
And so in the book, what I wanted to explore was that more rigorous approach of psychedelic assisted therapy. And I had a lot of hesitation here because I had a lot of bad experiences, both myself and with my friends and family members. But I also felt like we're in a moment where these compounds combined with psychotherapy are really starting to show some powerful promise for how we open the mind, and particularly how we open the mind to those corners of our psyche that are so vulnerable and so tender that it's very difficult for us to even get there in a normal state of consciousness.
Yeah, I hear you.
So, given all of that research, I was just like, I think if this is going to be a book about the practices we can use to cultivate openness, I want to see what's there and just
Yeah,
have an experience. And what I found was, for me, the practice was really powerful. I actually found a therapist who runs the psychedelic center at Naropa, which is a Buddhist university here in Boulder. So it's
Boulder.
kind of a very cool intersection of Buddhist meditation with psychedelics, which is what they're up to there. And what I found, so just one experience I had, I've had a pretty profound fear of flying for about 20 years. And there was one of these sessions, the compound we were using was ketamine, which is at this point the only legal compound for this kind of work in Colorado. But I was about to go on a trip in a couple days. So in my psyche, there was like, okay, I'm getting on an airplane, a little bit of anxiety and fear around that. And in the session, I had this experience of being on a plane. Like it felt like I was on a plane, and yet there was none of that habitual fear and anxiety. And I even saw myself dying in a plane crash. And it
Oh,
went from being this horrific image in my mind to being almost this like beautiful work of art. I think I said to my therapist at the time, it's a work of art. It's beautiful. Which sounds crazy, and it is crazy.
it does sound
But
crazy.
but having that experience and then integrating it in a number of therapy sessions afterwards, it really did change my experience of flight anxiety. And I guess I would add that I had spent 10 years, maybe more, doing Dzogchen open awareness meditation on every takeoff and landing, and just opening to the fear and being with the fear. And that there was something different that happened
Mm-hmm.
with the psychedelic assisted therapy that shifted it in just a different way. So I guess where I end on all of this is to say that for some people, this can be a really powerful practice of opening. It's not a necessary practice. There are all sorts of other tools we can use, which is what the rest of the book is about.
Yeah.
You shouldn't feel like you have to do it. Like I hate this idea that, oh, you're missing out and you don't
Yeah.
understand the reality and the nature of the universe without it. I'm like, no, that's all just a crock. Like that's not true at
Yeah.
all. But it can be really useful, I think.
Yeah, that's good. And I'm glad you explained it in the terms of the therapeutic approach, which I was going to let you do because it was your approach. Because like even we can be afraid of a lot of different things just because we don't know about them. It's like I went through uh, a, an opening to complex post-traumatic stress disorder right after the pandemic. Um, I didn't know I was very good at compartmentalizing, achieving, doing, I put a lot of some of the traumas that I had, and I've talked about this in my podcast before. Um, uh, in little neat packages. And I was sort of, I had some therapy when I had anxiety attacks in the early 20s, but I didn't ever reach out for therapy. And here I am, this longtime Buddhist practitioner, this meditator, I can't believe I would need therapy. So I did go to a therapist, and we did EMDR, which is it's just where you reprogram your mind a bit. And I kind of poo-pooed it. It sounded like a bunch of crap, really, when she she suggested it. But I opened up to it, and amazing. It didn't solve all my problems right away, but it cracked open a door to seeing things completely differently. Because if you spend years and years and years, like you said, of putting something that you're frightened of or that you don't want to see in a box, if somebody cracks open a door and puts a little light on it just in a nice little way, it changes everything. So that's the kind of the way I approached in reading that chapter on psychedelics is how that worked for me just with EMDR, even without,
Hmm.
any kind like ketamine or anything else. So that I'm glad you put that focus on there. Another one of your experiments, Nate. You're such an experimenter. You seem more like a psychologist than a philosopher with all your experiments. Um, you have to tell us more about the NRA gun training. In the book, it is the most delightful narrative of your experience with the people you met in this NRA gun training, and that your experiment was to like put yourself in the position where you were um interacting with the others, the other side, dealing with guns, all of that, uh so that you could just be open to it. And you saw that the people on the other side can agree on, and this is, I think, one of your lines from the book, agree on being open and listening to each other. So just give a little summary of that experience, because sort of like the screen binging, I don't know how many of us are going to walk into an NRA gun training program, but it does encourage us to go places where we wouldn't go, talking to people we wouldn't necessarily talk to. But I'll let you take it from there.
Yeah, the practice that I really wanted to explore was again, if we're going to cultivate openness, there's the internal practice of that where we can explore things like Dzogchen and meditation, and we can explore psychedelics potentially, yoga, all sorts of different things. But in that external practice of opening to our political adversaries, I realized that's a different kind of practice. So as I was thinking about like how would one explore this, I realized that I needed to identify the group that just felt the most opposite to my own perspective. And I mentioned before, I live in Boulder. It's a very kind of like left-leaning town. People meditate here and go for hikes and stuff like that. And guns really came up for me as just the one place where it was like, wow, that feels like a bridge too far. And so I found out that I could get my concealed carry permit by doing a training with the National Rifle Association in rural Colorado. And so that's what I did. I drove, outside of Boulder to this much more rural community. And one of the funny things that happened is I was dressing that morning and I was like, I want to make sure that I can make common ground here. So I put on my Denver Broncos hat. That's our celebrated sports franchise here in Colorado. And, I got there and one of my fellow NRA gun training students came in and she had a Kansas City Chiefs jacket on. That's our division rival. And so I made a little joke, I don't know that we can be friends. You're a Chiefs fan. I'm a Bronco fan. And her husband just comes up to me and he's like, oh, you don't have to worry about that at all. We stopped watching the NFL 5 years ago after the kneeling. So he's referring to that when players were kneeling for Black
Right.
Lives Matter. And our instructor got super fired up and he's like, yeah, I haven't watched the NFL. I don't give them a cent of my money because the way they dealt with that. And so that was this moment of like, whoa, we can't even agree on a shared passion for a modern gladiator sport, let alone guns, let alone Trump. So I actually left the room for a second to go to the bathroom, kind of compose myself. I come back, that same gentleman, I hear him say, I just think the right has all the best answers. And then he says, but we probably shouldn't assume things here. And he turns around and he points at me and he says, what side are you on?
Oh,
And
that
that
was
was this moment where I was like,
scary. Yeah.
well, I'm just going to say what's really going on for me, what's true for me. And I said, I guess I'm on the side of seeing if we can open up to all perspectives and all points of view, which is true. That's why I was there. And it was crazy because everyone in the room, their body language shifted, their energy shifted. They all started nodding their heads. And we had this whole conversation about how it's crazy that we can't talk to each other,
Right.
that we're so polarized. So it was this really interesting moment to realize we couldn't agree on guns. We couldn't agree on Trump. We couldn't even agree on being Denver Broncos fans, but we could agree on being more open. And
Yeah.
so that was wild. And I would just say one other thing, which is I think the main thing that I took away from that full immersion experience in the training was I just really got to experience that these people on the other side who I had all these like mental caricatures and stories about, like I got to experience their shared humanity and see that they're just like me in so many ways. They have family they care about, they have communities
Right.
they care about. They are they are good people who have a very different view of the world and have very different fears about how things are going to play out in society and how they need to protect themselves. But that shared humanity piece was, I think, the essence of what we can gain by opening to the other side.
Yeah, one of the anecdotes in that story about the people in this radical NRA training, um, you said you you said that you didn't actually use these words, I'll use them, that you dropped a bit of the feeling like you were separate from them, that
Right.
you actually connected with them. And after a while in the actual training sessions, you felt like, you know, this radical training is actually completely reasonable. This is what you said, even helpful to me, quote unquote, which cracked me up. And at some point, the instructor you said started to sound like some sort of new age meditation instructor because he kept talking about situational awareness, which was just, another phrase for mindfulness, although I've heard situational awareness in police training and combat. But, and then about how he said you should listen to your own intuition and you you actually paralleled it to a sort of a middle way approach to high conflicts, which the instructor called politely assertive. So it was not Buddhist middle way, but it really was Buddhist middle way. So what I loved was how you shared how much of your thinking changed. It wasn't just that you felt their commonness, their humanness, their whatever, but you felt, you saw in your mind your back and forth feelings. And just a little tip about how Nate writes is he shares his mental processing, which will actually make you laugh out loud many, many times because you'll
The
reckon.
voice in my head, I wanted to make that a character in the book.
And that character comes through loud and strong. And I completely identified with that character, and I think most people will. But I loved how you went back and forth and you like sort of understood the whole situation, and it it gave you a new sort of clarity. Um, and that led into how you said, not everybody might want to jump into going into NRA training, but that you should try to put yourself in a position where you are in a situation that is a little uncomfortable, and you try not to, respond in your typical way. And I'll just give you a little anecdote so I won't talk too long, but it's like about the week before the election, oh, well, maybe 2 weeks before the election, I was taking a walk in the neighborhood and I met up with a neighbor and a friend, and I know this person is right leaning. Um, and I forgot because we haven't talked about anything like that for so long. I totally forgot that she was right leaning. And I said, oh, casually, because New York now has early voting, and I said, "Have you voted yet?" And she said, "Oh yeah, I went 2 days ago. It wasn't too bad." And it was great. And I said, "Yeah, it's really good that I." And then she goes, there's early voting is like peaking. A lot of people are early voting. I said, "I think that's a good sign." And then I said, "Whoops." Like I said, I forgot that. I don't think we're on the same side of the spectrum. So I'm glad you voted. And just like that. And I just kind of left it
Nice.
like that. And then we talked about, she just said, yeah, I don't know. I just think we should. I don't like either candidate. And so I said, yeah, I hear what you're saying. And it was like, it was a
Hmm.
very, I sort of like, I disarmed the whole situation. But for a moment, I felt complete panic because
Hmm.
but I also loved that I completely forgot that she was not. I wasn't like,
Yeah,
here's the election, here she comes. Uh-oh. You know what I'm saying? It's like
totally.
it was an interesting experience for me. So
Yeah.
I don't want to take too much time, but that's what that reminded me of a little bit. Um, I mentioned to you when prior to us recording that philosophy has been a thing for me, and it was part of my undergraduate major, and it's still a big interest. And so I was totally excited when you mentioned that your PhD dissertation in political philosophy, and I never heard of the German philosopher Habermas.
Jürgen Habermas. Yeah.
Who you studied for 2 years, but you
Yeah.
wrote that he specialized in the topic of how we talk to each other as fellow citizens. Who knew
That's right.
Habermas? I mean, really. But what you explain is Habermas's distinction between the ways we talk to each other about politics as either strategic or communicative action. I like this, and can you explain a little more about that?
Yeah. He's a very difficult thinker to read. It
I
did take
won't
me a couple of
try.
years to decode Habermas. I remember I had my wife read my dissertation when I finished, and she basically stopped in the Habermas chapter. She was like, that is not even English. I don't know what that is. But in the midst of all that complexity, he says something that I think is really interesting, which, as you mentioned, is that there's a fundamental distinction between two ways in which we talk about politics. The strategic mode of action is when we are talking about politics or having a conversation with somebody where the underlying intent is to win.
Yeah, exactly.
Communicative action, by contrast, is where we are talking about politics or having a conversation with somebody, and the underlying intent is to understand. And
Yeah.
this is a distinction that I think we all know, but it's often unconscious. And I actually think if you check in with your body during a political conversation, you will know almost instantly whether you're engaged in that communicative form
Yeah.
of action or strategic action. And the key tell is what's happening in your nervous system. If you feel like adrenaline, your heart is racing, your breath is getting short, there's a wave of anger moving up through your system, I can almost guarantee you're operating in the zone of strategic
Strategic.
action. And I think actually we've been moving so far toward that strategic side of the spectrum as a society that that's almost like the natural default state of politics.
Yeah.
I mean, I think you're considered some sort of naive idiot if you're out there, trying to understand and listen to the other side. It's almost like that position has been so deeply marginalized that it's like it's not even on the table anymore.
Yeah.
So I think if we're that far over on the strategic side of the spectrum, then to me, that's a reason to really invest in this more communicative form of conversation. That's what I would call opening to the other side, really.
Yeah.
And as we talked about before, I really do believe that that kind of mindset is contagious and that the more we approach our neighbors and people at the store and our family members with that communicative, open form of conversation, that just has ripple effects. And that ultimately is, I think, the way that we get out of polarization. I don't think it's going to come from some magical candidate who argues that we should all be unified and one. I don't think it's going to come from public policy. I think it's going to come from individual people like you and me changing the way we interact and changing the way we approach the world.
Yeah. I totally agree. I absolutely totally agree. Um, and just like my experience with my neighbor, it showed me that. It's like I changed immediately. I like stopped.
Mm,
My normal go-to would have been strategic. I honestly
yeah.
will tell you that. And I must have been because I was practicing or something that I just stopped that down right away. And I was like, I was so proud of myself. I came home and told my wife and said, "You can't believe what I just did."
Uh, well, I think that these are the fruits of the practice too. That one of the reasons we meditate is it's like the strengthening and conditioning program that we engage in, such that when we're in one of those moments, when we're actually in the game of life,
Right.
and bam, it happens, and we
Yeah,
can
yeah.
feel the wave of anger or whatever it is. Like I think that's the where we see the fruits of the practice because we have that ability sometimes
Sometimes, yeah. That's a
to
key word.
see what's happening, allow it to move through, like, just have a moment of mindfulness rather than totally biting the hook and just allowing our reactive patterns to run the show. So that's
Yeah.
why we do it. I think that's why I do it anyway.
It's why I do it too. It's like they're not, they're sometimes very few and far between depending on where you are. But yeah,
Exactly. Yeah, nobody's perfect here, but we
yeah.
try.
The chapter on open meditation is very, very, very important, says me, wink, wink. But because switching my practice to open meditation, I actually was given Dzogchen instructions by a Dzogchen Lama like 25 years ago or something.
Wow.
And yeah, I'm older. So back when it was like secret, right? It's like you had to
Right.
have a
Yeah.
secret empowerment, and I got the
Yeah.
secret empowerment, and I got uh, you know, the 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 open, the blast. I think his promise was, "You're going to know your mind," and but anyway, um, I sort of I practiced it for a while, and then I didn't practice it, and then I practiced it virtually with Lama Surya Das for a while, and then didn't practice it, and then I got into Japanese Mahayana and with the Zen Shin approach, so there was less of a focus on that. And then, oh, recently, last couple years, one especially last year, I really got into getting back into that open awareness sort of meditation, which is sort of another way to talk about Dzogchen, because Dzogchen is not so secret anymore, and every people are talking about it. And it boy, I'll tell you, I saw that it saved me. It
Mm,
totally saved me. And I want people to understand that this is not some scary, just the thought, the sound of Dzogchen sounds so ridiculous. But but it saved me from my, CPSD, trauma-induced craziness, my doom scrolling. It saved me from watching the pain and craziness in the world, like watching a car accident. It saved me from my own judgment, my own bullshit, right? And it enabled me to open my awareness wide enough, just like you say, open your awareness wide enough to encompass everything. All my emotional and physical pain, my fear, my despair, and all the isness that is life. I'm working on my second book now. I wrote a book called Everyday Buddhism, Real Life Teachings and Practices for Real Change. And that was about, I, I think, well, released it 7 years ago. And then I started one in the pandemic, but because I was such a screwed up mess, I couldn't really finish the book. And then I decided to write a book about um, how I was in the pandemic and how it was about not seeing things as they really are, which is the first of the Noble
mm,
Eightfold Path, right view. And like you, I wanted to expose my humanness and how seeing things as they really are absolutely changed that stuff. You wrote, I say isness or all that is or things as they are. And you said, all of this is the this. I love that.
mm.
All of this is the this. Can you talk about more about this wonderful practice? So I'll shut up about your retreat experience, your general experience with Dzogchen and open awareness, and you offer instructions in this book, including a section on street openness, which I've practiced before, so I love that. And
Yeah.
just your experience with all of it. I want you to like people hear me talk all the time on this podcast. I'd like to hear you tempt my listeners to try this kind of practice.
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think almost every form of meditation is amazing. And so I don't like, sometimes in these conversations, it can be like, this one's better than this one, and you should do
Yeah,
this
yeah,
one.
yeah, yeah.
It's like they're
Yeah,
all amazing.
they are.
And yet I think this uh, set of open awareness practices, Mahamudra, Dzogchen, they're really interesting to me because, again, the premise of my thinking starts from this idea that we're closing down
Right.
internally, externally. There's this just momentum of closure. And subjectively and experientially, what that feels like is that there's no space in the mind, that the mind becomes this very tight, claustrophobic space. And so, if that's the condition we're living in, then a practice that's designed to give us more space, more expansiveness in the mind, to me, that's kind of feels like what the doctor ordered in the
Yeah.
sense that, like, at least for me in my condition and given my particular neuroses and karma and all that, it feels like cultivating that space is just one of the most nurturing, healing things that I can do. So what I love about that whole family of practices is that, first of all, it's very non-conceptual. And as a philosopher, I can get so hung up on the conceptual stuff that like I just forget about the present moment and experience and what's happening right now.
The mental bling.
Yeah, the mental
Yeah.
bling. But it's also it's amazingly simple. Not that it's easy, but it's amazingly simple in the sense that there's just this attempt to be with things as they are, see where you are in a more panoramic state of awareness, expanding your awareness. I mean, it's surprisingly simple. And to me, the gift of that is not that all the neuroses go away or the anxiety goes away or the trauma goes away or the sadness goes away, but simply that when there's a little bit more space, it's easier to be with that experience. So I talk in the book about this metaphor that Ram Dass uses that I really like, where he talks about, in our ordinary state of consciousness, it's kind of like all we can see is this dark cloud in the sky. And that cloud could be irritation or fear or sadness or whatever it is. But with a practice like Dzogchen, it's almost like we're taking the camera and we're zooming out and we're going into wide angle, and the cloud is still there, but we see that it's surrounded by all of this space, all of this blue sky, and so to me, that's just like such a great metaphor for what we're trying to do with this kind of a practice is to
Y-
see the space, not to get rid of, but to see that there's a bigger space there. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
go ahead.
and like you said about it's not like the other forms of meditation aren't productive and helpful for you, and they are all good, and like
They're all great. Yeah.
and it's like when I start my Dzogchen practice, when I do practice, I usually start with some shamatha because you have to like
I
center
do the
yourself.
same thing. It's
Yeah,
funny. I
I do the focus on the breathing. Got it. You have to kind of, or you can't just like sit down and boom. It's like it was not going to happen like that. But one thing that my little trick that I noticed was that how that didn't work for me when I was going through a lot of stuff and in this this last decade of just like crazy world stuff is how it didn't work for me is like I kept aiming at what I was supposed
Mhm.
to get. I kept, which is that focusing in. It was such an inward thing. And I think you talked about that. Instead of attaining, we're supposed to like just sink in, go down. That's much easier to do. So when I stopped aiming at like whatever the practice was, like being with my breath or metta or whatever, when I stopped aiming at that and just sat with things as they are in a great natural perfection, the innate goodness that is at our core, or Buddha nature is sometimes referred to, it just, I mean, it's really like Zazen and Shikantaza, like just sitting. It's just being what you are, where you are, and even if that is in the midst of trauma, right? It's just being there.
Yeah.
So,
Well, so I really resonate with that. And this is one of the things I was trying to get at in the book is that there's this trap with all practices, definitely in my experience with an opening style of practice, where we're trying to like we have a mental model, a kind of platonic form in our mind of what opening should be like.
right.
And it's really like expansive and it's blissful. It's like when you're on the beach and you're just sitting there and like you're so relaxed and it's all like super wide open. And I started to call this in my own practice happy land.
Happy
This
land. I was like,
idea that opening is like seeing the world in open awareness just feels like amazing. You've got pleasure radiating from your genitals to the skull of, your crown of
so
your head and
yeah,
like, and this is just a big trap, or at least it
it
was for
is.
me, because like and that's the reason I wanted to talk about a retreat experience where I just kept hitting this again and again till I finally got it, where it was like, I wanted my opening practice to have that blissful, amazing quality. And when it didn't, I felt like I was doing something wrong. And what I started to see is just that like if we're actually opening to things as they are, that means we're opening to all of it.
Yep,
Maybe
all
it's
of
the
it.
bliss, maybe it's the shame spiral, maybe it's the like panic, maybe, if we're gonna open to things as they are, it's gonna include the whole freaking spectrum. And
Yeah.
that took me a long time to realize, and I forget again today. I mean, it's like I'm trying to remember every day, but
Oh yeah,
boy, my
yeah.
mind does not want to accept that one.
Yeah, it's true. It's like it's like, you sit down for a meditation in the morning and you have a particularly bad meditation where all you're doing is thinking about the next podcast, what to have for dinner, blah blah blah, and you just can't get comfortable, and your toe itches, and it's like just everything. And why did I say that to my mother 50 years ago? And it's like it's all that stuff.
Totally.
Yeah, and it's like, and then you get up and you feel like such a failure, but you have to realize that you just sat there, and that was good enough. That
Yeah,
was just
exactly.
absolutely good enough. By the way, I love the story of you on the retreat and running down the hill to the bar,
Well,
and
I
then
didn't go to the bar. I wanted to go to the bar.
I
I
know. It was
didn't
the
I
dr-
didn't
I'm
actually
not.
go there.
I didn't say you did. I said the dream of running down the hill to the
Oh
bar
yeah,
and
in my
having
mind
a
I was at the bar.
cheeseburger and French fries, lots of French fries, and
Yeah,
and,
that's
and
right.
a beer and a shot of tequila. I just see now. You guys got to read this book. He's so funny. Um, okay, you close the book, almost close the book with a practice you learned from your grandmother Hilda, and you called it letting go. Can you give us some insight into how we can do that, and also that because you also talk about how we could open too much,
Yeah,
um, and I
right.
think that's related to letting go. There's sort of like interwoven there, and I'll just get
Yeah.
just give us a couple minutes. I know we're getting close to the end here, so just give us a couple minutes on that because I love the story of your grandmother. I had a same kind of sort of relationship with my grandmother, so that was a great story.
Yeah, my grandmother was really my ultimate spiritual teacher. She was just this amazing woman, lived till she was 97. And I was fortunate enough to be in Colorado where she was when she was living out her final weeks. And I spent some time with her, and it was really amazing how dialed into her practice she continued to be. I remember I showed up and she's like, Nate, do you know God is love? God loves everybody, loves me, loves you. I'm just like, whoa, whoa, like,
Whoa.
how are you in this space at the verge of death? And so I don't know. I felt like I had some sort of a transmission from her that was around this idea of the power of letting go of your own attempts to control life, especially when you reach those moments where it's almost impossible to control,
Yeah.
and that we can either sort of resist in those moments, or there is this other option that's terrifying on some level, but also really powerful of letting go. And I think that this was also a recurring theme as I spent all of these years just playing with these practices and playing with these various polarities, that I started to realize that there was just something really interesting happening at the juncture between a really closed down and a more open state,
Yeah.
particularly when we're talking about opening to some of those more edgy experiences or more difficult parts of ourselves. That, yeah, there was like a practice happening. So maybe there was Dzogchen, or maybe there was a psychedelic assisted therapy session, or maybe it was just life or whatever it was. There was like a context happening around it. But in between that closed and open state, it felt like there were just these moments of like allowing whatever's going to happen next to happen, not
Yeah.
knowing what's going to happen, total uncertainty, maybe a lot of fear, but just this kind of willingness to let life show me the answer.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and like as I'm saying all this, I'm realizing that I feel like this is one of those practices where language absolutely breaks down. But
Yeah.
I think
Yeah.
everybody has a reference point to just getting to one of those states where you're so broken down that there's nothing you can do other than let go,
Yep.
and that there's such a like incredible power to that. So I just wanted to talk about that as, and it's not like we can go out and necessarily manufacture these moments.
No.
They kind of just happen. Like I think we can cultivate the ground so that they arise more frequently, but I don't think we can go out and be like, I'm going to now surrender to my childhood traumas. You know, it's like that's not how it works. It just kind of it happens. But the
Exactly.
practices I think help cultivate the ground.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
It reminds me of that Zen teaching story about you go up to the top of the 100-foot pole and you take the next step.
yeah, I love that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
such a great metaphor.
yeah. It's like because it's like you're aiming, you're going there, you're going there. You get, well, it'll get better up here. It'll get better up here, and then you
Yeah,
just step right off. And if
yeah,
that's not letting go, I don't know what is. Um,
totally.
you know, next I don't want to short shift this part because it's very important. We don't have to talk about it, but I just want to clue the listeners in. You share an in-depth open toolkit at the back of the book, which is really
Right.
brilliant. It's not like having an appendix or anything. It's like a bunch of how-tos, which you actually intersperse throughout the chapters, but this is really great. And it includes political polarization tools, which I think are pretty important right now. So
Hmm.
I urge listeners not only, yeah, buy the book, but check that out. And so, can you give us, and we can end with this, insight into these tools? How, like, how did you get to these tools? I mean, I could see a lot of maybe sort of where they came from, the origination of some of them, but boy, to put them all together in sort of this encyclopedia of like openness
Mm.
is pretty brilliant. So, how'd you get there?
I think the tools just came as part of the journey. So, studying yoga really intensively in Los Angeles, studying meditation in Dzogchen, studying philosophy, there are just a lot of really fascinating tools that arose through that process. But
Right.
then I would say the other source is just the experience of my own life and my own difficulties and challenges that I've experienced throughout the years. I have this thing that I don't actually talk about this explicitly in the book, and but it is there's kind of a meta practice running in the background for me all the time, which is when I'm confronted with a challenging situation, I like to run the thought experiment of like, what if this were just like an experiment? You know, what if this like political shitstorm we're living through or this physical problem, the sciatica I have, what if it's just kind of like this interesting experiment?
And not real.
And
Yeah.
yeah, and an opportunity for me to just like try out a bunch of crazy stuff and like, you know, explore my own body and my own mind and just see kind of what sticks. And like I actually find that that meta mindset is quite useful because
Yeah.
it can kind of diffuse and make these things feel less personal, where it's like, I don't know, this feels like Ram Dass talked about it as like your curriculum. That's another way of putting it. Like, I must have a sciatica curriculum right now. That's interesting. Wasn't expecting that one, you know, but like, well, what does that mean? And what's it like to try
Yeah.
out different practices? So I feel like life is a really fertile ground for these kinds of tools and practices because it's just if it's all an experiment, then you run the experiment enough times and you start to find a few things that kind of work.
Yeah, it's like n equals one, like they talk about, in science
Right.
experiments. You use yourself as the experimenter. My brother, he's a physicist, and he experiments with nutrition and health stuff. And he always call. I said, "Well, how did you figure that out?" He said, "Yeah, n equals one. It worked for me."
Right. Yeah, and
So,
science, a lot of scientists will tell you, oh, you got to have a big N You
Yeah,
have to
you
have
got
lots of
right.
data and it's all anecdotal if it's just you. But I disagree. I mean, we talked about Thoreau earlier. He's an N of one. He wrote one of the most influential books in the history of philosophy about his N of one.
Yeah,
And so I
right.
think it's really powerful to explore your own experience and see what arises.
Well, yeah, and just it's like just putting it in that framework of this is just an experiment. It takes yourself out of it. The subjectivity goes away. It kind of breaks up that
Totally.
dualism, and like, it really is a practice of no self, which is what we get to
Yeah.
sort of when we do open awareness things. But it really does. It's like I used to when I was working as a career coach and a resume writer, and I had all these deadlines and they were freaking me out, and I couldn't handle it. And I used to say, okay, I'm going into vacation mind. And then
Nice.
I would I'd go sit at the computer, and somehow when I'd sit down to write something, vacation mind changed everything. I never felt
Mm.
pressure. I just, I'll say this, I'll say
I
that. You know what
love
I'm
it.
saying? So I think it's the same
Yeah.
kind of thing. Oh, Nate, this has been a
Awesome.
brilliant conversation. There's so much more I would love to talk to you about, and we could talk forever, but I just want to say I'll post links to your social media and website in the show notes where you can discover more about Nate and download free meditations, explore his blog, sign up for his newsletter, and even listen to some cool jazz performed by Nate, which I just spent some time doing. But before we close, is there anything else you'd like to say that I didn't mention or we didn't get to?
No, this was so fun. Thank you for having me on, Wendy. It's really an honor.
Thank you, Nate. That's it for this episode. I hope you enjoyed Nate's conversation as much as I did. He's just an absolute charming and brilliant human being. So I hope that came through. I have posted links to Nate's website and social media in the show notes where you can discover more about him and his offerings, including a weekly newsletter and a free guide to creating a little more space in your mind with 18 practices, tips, insights, and habit forming strategies to create more mental space in the midst of life's chaos. And now on to my announcements. I hope you stuck around for them. These are new announcements for Patreon supporters. We have dissolved our private community on the private Heartland platform and opened it up through Patreon. Patreon will make it more open and accessible for all supporters of this podcast who might like a place to hang out with others. Membership tiers have lower suggested donations, and one tier includes a free subscription to the Everyday Buddhism Substack, where you'll find my other weekly podcasts called Words from My Teachers, and a new Zen koans for Everyday section, plus more articles and notes. I hope you check out the new Patreon community where we have many places for discussion and the ability to join the once monthly Everyday Sangha on the first Saturday of the month at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time, and a drop-in gathering on the third Saturday at 10 a.m. U.S. Eastern Time. We have a new offering in the Patreon community also. I will be inviting many Buddhist and meditation teachers to offer guided meditations. We started with meditations by Kimberly Brown, a returning guest on the podcast. I will also have a mini podcast conversation with each of these teachers about their insights into meditation. This is a free offering for all of the membership community Patreon patrons. You can support this podcast and the other activities of Everyday Buddhism by becoming a Patreon supporter. Stay tuned for more details about the community, about the Sangha, and about my Substack, as they will change and evolve as my arm heals and I'm able to give everything a little more time. If you don't follow me or Everyday Buddhism on any social media platforms we post in, you can go to the Everyday Buddhism website and become a member by joining the Patreon community. Go to www.everyday-buddhism.com and click on the link that says membership, or you can join through Patreon at patreon.com/everyday Buddhism. Links to joining are posted in the show notes. I thank all of you who contribute. This podcast, the community, and Sangha depend on your donations to continue to exist. I do not seek podcast sponsors. I don't ask for financial commitments through paid podcast memberships. So my work and the cost needed to support what I do is entirely self-funded, except for your donations. Please consider a one-time or continuing donation through Patreon or on my website's donate tab. Or you can buy me a coffee using the coffee cup link on the website. You can find all these links in the show notes. And thanks too to all of you who write in with comments and questions. Another way you can help is to rate and review the podcast on your favorite podcast platform. It's important to share the podcast with others through your ratings and your reviews. If you find it helpful in your life, you need to share it so others can join in. And if you could, take a minute to comment so people will know why you like Everyday Buddhism, not just that you like it. Okay, that's it for the announcements today. Until next time, keep finding ways to make yours and everyone's days better.